Today, I'm joined by the lovely Aimee Keushguerian. Do I pronounce that right?
It's perfect.
It's perfect. Okay. So, in true millennial fashion, Aimee wears a multitude of hats. So, Aimee is the founder of Zulal Wines. We're going to talk about how awesome that brand is. You are a contributor in so many ways to Kush, which is the historic family wine sparkling or a historic family sparkling wine project. You contribute to Wineworks, which was Armenia's first custom crush facility, works with brands all over the world. You work with Evian Wine Academy, which is education and training in Armenia. You were the subject of the Cup of Salvation in 2024. So that was very exciting. And then somewhere amidst all that back in the day, you launched a magazine, which really surprised me when I went in and did the due diligence. So clearly you have much more energy than most of the rest of us. And I am super impressed. And I'm so, so pleased to have you joining me today, Aimee.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
So I think that, well, let's just tell a little bit of a story. When I started planning this series, which is all about culture and, of course, business, and then how that relates to wine, you were one of the very first people on my list. And the reason for this, for anybody who can't see your lovely face, is that you are actually part of the generation that wine culture right now is struggling to get to reach. And at the same time, you are one of the builders of wine industry, wine culture, and really sitting at the crossroads of Armenia, the world's oldest documented wine region, with a Soviet background that possibly was not so great for heritage in an industry where heritage is everything. And you even went so far as to repatriate from life abroad in America, in Italy, living in Dijon, and now you spend most of your time in Armenia, where with all of these hats, you are actively working to build a wine culture. And I think that's fascinating. I think that there are so many lessons that the wine industry needs from you and your cohort. So let's go.
Okay, great. That's a lot to unpack, but I think it's a great topic and very relevant to
I have three
everyone right
pages
now.
of questions, so everyone just settle in, grab a glass of wine. Here we go. It's Friday afternoon. Um,
Let's do it.
so, Aimee, I know that I'm talking to you. You were in Paris today. You do all of these different jobs, and let's kind of like go through some quick beats. I'm going to run through them and give me like the 1 to 2 liner on what each of these means before we dig into those. So we're going to start with Zulal, which of course is one of my personal favorites. What's Zulal?
Zula is an experimental wine brand where we make small microvinifications of rare and almost lost indigenous grapes. It's a
Kush?
small project. Kush, okay. Kush, 2 sentences. Kush is one of the highest elevation vineyards that produces traditional method sparkling wine in the world.
There's something very interesting about your vineyards.
Vineyards. This is something that we mention sometimes and sometimes don't mention. The vineyards actually sit between the two military bases, between the Azeri military base and the Armenian military base, because these vineyards were planted 100 years ago before the Soviet Union.
Amazing. All right, Wineworks.
Okay, Wineworks. I feel like I'm being tested.
You are.
Wineworks is a custom crush winery incubator that was responsible for creating a lot of infrastructure while we rebuilt the Armenian wine industry.
Evian Wine Academy.
Evian Wine Academy is the first wine school, and let's say prominent wine school that's co-accredited with Geisenheim University in Armenia.
Amazing. All right. And then last but not least, let's talk about that most dangerous wine in the world that got featured on Cup of Salvation.
Oh, that one's special. Milana. Milana is technically the first modern wine made since the revolution in 1979 from Iranian grapes, but it's produced in Armenia.
But it's produced in Armenia. Okay. So where do we begin? I think for me, kind of working back into history, I want to start with this notion of heritage. Like wine is fascinated and in love with its own heritage stories. And, we always talk about how do you evolve from heritage? Can you evolve heritage? Is heritage versus history? So Armenia, the oldest documented winemaking region in the world, but most recently with a heritage of Soviet mass production. How do you start to build interest, relevance, fineness, for want of a better word, when the story that you have inherited is fractured or perhaps not the legacy that you want to carry on?
Yeah, well, I mean, so Armenia is interesting because it's both, let's say, the birthplace of wine, where Vitis vinifera originated. It's also a place marked by the Soviet culture and mass production in terms of narrative. And it's also, but this duality, it also is being the oldest, it's also one of the newest. So we sit kind of at these crossroads of having an ancient history at a Soviet time, but then also being one of the newest wine regions. So it's a really interesting place to look at how heritage is seen. Bordeaux and Burgundy, for them, continuity is their identity. And Armenia actually gives us the space to be able to reinvent. So we're not starting an industry with nothing, we've started it with this legacy and this heritage, but we're using heritage as something to build on and something to reinvent. So it actually gives us the freedom to be able to continue to adapt.
So when you say build on or reinvent, how do you craft that? Who crafts that? I will say that I was lucky enough to be there, visit the surrounds, go to the vineyards, meet some of the team, effectively the young people who are there and trying to build a positive, resilient, glowing Armenian wine culture. So what does that experience of redefining the legacy practically look like?
So redefining, really, it means that we become very good storytellers. And so when we do tell these stories, we're building on stories from the Neolithic era, from the ancient times as an Armenian empire, how we were great merchants during the times of the Babylonians and Sumerians. And then, we build on how in Vayots Dzor, for example, is a region that was somewhat remote from the Soviet Union and it was somewhat protected, so preserved. So we were able to continue to make wine. We have all these stories that become our heritage and become our legacy, but they don't define us. They become our background. And then what defines us is really our quality and our positioning of what we do next, which is to be seen.
And of course, that's a collective effort, right? Because if we look at the work that Pauline Vicard and her team have done, they have really explored how collective reputation is so important for building fineness. So you, I assume, are having to work with other producers or other storytellers, somms, educators in the region to define that as a region worthy of producing fine wine?
Yeah, it's definitely collective. Building something collectively is the only way to have, to be strong. Individual wineries can have the story, but if they don't work together and we don't have this common narrative, then we don't have a regional identity. So it's actually really, really important for us to come together, which is difficult because as Armenians, we actually are very fragmented and separated. But the wine tends to be something that actually does connect a lot of people and connects us together. But the only way to really, really move forward and have a regional identity is for everyone to kind of agree on what our identity is.
What your identity is. And so talking about that identity, of course, one thing we know is that Armenia is one of the few destinations accessible to Russian tourists today, even as you are courting the American markets and the diaspora. So how do cultural expectations of taste and service and story, how do those diverge when you're trying to accommodate what are effectively, like I mentioned, Russians versus non-Russians, but then we also have those who are very much entrenched in the older expectations of Armenian wine, and with that come price points, positioning, quality, and then a new culture of we want experimental. We'll talk about Zulal in a little bit, or we want to feel like we're exploring or we're discovering or we're just filling our brains with awesome stuff. So how do you reconcile these these subcultures that really need to buy your wine?
Yeah, so for Armenian wine specifically, the US and Russian markets are the largest, right? And the US kind of dictates as the US goes, so does the rest of the world in a lot of ways. But Russians are different. And Western buyers are different too. And then we also have kind of like a diasporans that are part of a community as well. And they all have different expectations of taste and service and story, let's say. And the challenge for us is designing experiences that can speak across different cultures. Because sometimes there's consumers that want to hear the war stories and want to hear about the geopolitical conflict that affects our winemaking. And then some just want to hear a fairy tale about how it's the birthplace of the vine and they don't want to hear anything negative, right? And so for us, we have to really learn how to carry all these narratives at once and choose which one to tell at which time. That's kind of going to be one of our largest strengths. We have all these millennial stories to tell that are powerful, but who do we tell it to and when? For example, sometimes someone might really be interested. A Western buyer probably really wants to hear about the volcanic soils and the high elevation vineyards, and then maybe the diasporan really wants to hear your family heritage story. And the Russians definitely focus more on hospitality and generosity and sort of more of a luxury experience. But I don't think we really need to tell one story. It's that we have all these different stories that we kind of need to cater and figure out when to tell.
With that in mind, I want to lead into Zulal because I am personally completely in love with what you're doing with Zulal. Zulal is indigenous varietals that we're just not going to possibly have ever tasted these wines before, and maybe we will never taste them again. So, can you talk to me more in depth about why you did it, where it comes from, how you make it happen, who you sell to, and yeah, and then I'll keep asking questions.
Yeah. So Zulal is my project. And I founded it at a very young age. I think, I've always been kind of entrepreneurial. And I moved to Armenia because my father invited me to come work on Kush, which is our traditional method sparkling wine brand. And I fell in love with just, kind of was mesmerized with the fact that we're rebuilding a wine region, collective we as the entire industry is redefining a new wine region. And I noticed that the direction of the wine industry is going towards Areni as a grape is sort of becoming the flagship grape variety, similar to that Malbec in Argentina and Pinot Noir in Burgundy. And we're all moving towards a generation of Areni will be the defining grape of our wine country. But our region, because we have so much genetic diversity and so much history of viticulture, we actually have an incredibly huge amount of indigenous grape varieties. But you can only find little grapes parcels here and there. And it's very difficult to find some of these grapes. You can find maybe a couple bunches on the hillside or a couple vineyard parcels here and there with these grapes. And when everyone was making Areni, I realized, wait a minute, but there's all these indigenous grapes that need to be experimented with. So I founded Zulal really to be experimental and to make wines that maybe we might not be able to find again, find grapes that are rare or almost lost and forgotten. And in fact, what we've done is on the grapes that we really enjoyed making wine from, now we started a nursery project where we're propagating and planting them again. So we're preserving these grape varieties in a way. So there's a lot of intentional let's say experimentation with Zulal, which is what really, really drives and drove me to start the brand. It also has a lot of challenges because some people fall in love with the Tozot, which is a beautiful grape variety, but I may never find that grape again. And so, but it's also a little bit of it's an interesting project because our generation, most of the consumers right now don't want to buy the same wine again. A lot of them want to just constantly buy different wines. So it's actually is an interesting project that has its challenges, but also has a lot of benefits to it.
So how do you solve the problem either through systems or messaging of saying, you're not going to have this forever. This may never exist again. Here's a handful of bottles. Go for your life. And next vintage, we'll see what else we have.
So I think that's actually, I would say that's actually the benefit of it. Because, and flip the kind of narrative on that, because my generation grew up with so much access to travel, to global cuisines, to cultures, to online information, and that access to everything creates this sense of curiosity and openness, but it also creates this like lack of commitment. It creates this restlessness in us.
Yeah.
Like we don't want this sort of like commitment to drinking the same wine because we're loyal and because we inherited our allocation from our father, which a lot of Europeans inherit allocations, and so they drink the same wines for a very long time. But our generation doesn't really want that anymore. We want variety, and we want a sense. We actually crave to taste something that might not come again. We crave something that we might not get. That scarcity is actually, that scarcity becomes valuable.
It's the experience. It's the
Yeah, it's the
experience and
experience.
the memory of, and that is really something that we see when we look at like the ephemeral, right? The rise within social media of ephemeral content, that actually access to the experience in and of itself is scarce, reportable. It can be clout building. So if we look at something like Instagram, which everybody knows that I have a love-hate affair with social media, but certainly there are those highlight reels of, look, I've had this bottle that nobody's ever had before. Now, what I do want to ask, though, I'm putting you on the spot. You're going to be like our resident millennial expert for the day, because you are also very multicultural in that you was it born in the States, lived in Italy, lived in France, repatriated to Armenia. Did I get that right?
Correct.
Okay, so we've got working in a couple different generations, working across a lot of borders. One of the things that we're always asking ourselves is, how representative are these statements of generations across borders, right? Across geographic borders. So, would you say that an Armenian 29-year-old has the same mindset and purchasing criteria as someone next door to you in Paris, or what you saw when you were in the US?
Absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely not. Yeah. I, I mean, I would say the US tends to has a culture more on innovation. It's a newer country versus old world countries, right? The US has this culture on innovation and experience and the new, this kind of fascination with the new, where Europeans have this fascination with tradition and heritage. It's still a sense of, for them, it's pride to continue tradition, to be traditional, versus in the US where it's a sense of pride to be reinvented, and actually it's funny because we have this conversation about cultures and, French, I've been living in France. So French versus Americans, and Americans, as a culture, we've learned to become performers. We're praised for putting on good performances. And in France, we're actually praised. We're in France, the culture is the opposite. And you're praised for being calm and collected and, not being the loudest person in the room. The loudest person in the room is seen as someone who's superficial, who doesn't actually mean well. And so these two completely different cultures. And I think it definitely translates in how they buy wine as well. I mean, look at France. France still only drink French wine. In the US, we make wine in California and all over America, but they drink wine from all over the world. So it's really deeply rooted, these cultural differences.
We really find this difficult because, of course, same thing in New Zealand. I live in Europe, same thing in Europe. That in New Zealand, they'll jokingly say, "Oh, yes, we knew you were here because you were the loudest in the room." Because, as the American, and trying to market the same brand across borders can actually be so challenging because of that. Because the leadership, so say if you're working with a non-US brand, well, the leadership themselves are a part of that culture of what my mom would call classy, of modesty. And it is will let the product speak for itself, and quality and longevity, all of these things matter. And my American clients, God love them. I'm so impressed that this can happen. But my American clients will absolutely put that flag in that sand and be like, we make the best California wine you've ever had. Whether it's true or not, they have zero problem saying it. And you know, and my French clients are like, well, we would never say that because our neighbors would look at us and say, but that's not true. So even like the marketing within those cultures is so fragmented, but you have to tell the same story no matter where you are. Like you can't really, you know, we can't fib, sadly.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. So, okay, then within that, if we look at something like Zulal, which that is mostly positioned for the American market, right?
Yep.
And you've directed that toward, for the most part, a younger audience of collectors, experience collectors. Like, how do you go out into the world and connect with that chosen audience?
Yeah, so this is, you know, a big question that we're constantly reevaluating because the way that people buy wine changes based on the technological advancements of that given time period, right? So even back, you know, 20, 30 years ago, if you had a winery that was making experimental wine and it was, you know, targeted for, you know, it was at a certain price point. So it was targeted for a specific buyer that could afford this wine, that wanted a collector's item, you know, how do you reach them? And what we found recently, and also working with you, Polly, is that the strength lies in the community that we build around it. And looking at marketing more like community building actually is what drives your loyalty in your consumers. And that's the biggest kind of shift and perspective that we found, is that marketing and selling your wine isn't just marketing and selling wine, it's building a community around it. It's that they follow where you go for tastings, they follow your new releases, they know your philosophy, they look into the family history, they really understand the brand, or they follow the new releases. With Zulal, we're releasing 1 or 2 new wines every year, so it's exciting. So they wait for the next release. And it all comes down to community. And that, I think, is the most valuable thing that any wine brand has today, is the community that they form around it.
So, do you and Vahe tend to agree on all of this? Or is there a bit of a tension between former generation and next generation? What do those conversations look like? I mean, the two of you lead these brands together, and you're sitting around a table, hopefully drinking some wine and discussing, how do we build, how do we market, where do we go, what do we charge, what do the labels look like? Like, how do you drive this in a space where, you know, maybe other people sitting in your shoes don't have the most progressive boss slash dad on the planet?
Agree. And I think I am pretty lucky that I do have a very progressive, you know, Middle Eastern father, which a lot of people can't say. A lot of people can't say, but of course he comes from a certain era, and you know, and my children are going to say the same thing about me. You know, they're going to be like, whatever the next TikTok, whatever thing, I'm going to be like, I don't know what that is. But then again, who knows? Honestly, my father's on Instagram, so he's very, like I said, he's very up to date. But we do see the world differently, and we see the wine world differently. And I think you definitely have to approach a tradition that's such one of the oldest trades in the world with both. You have to approach it because there's still a huge segment of the industry that is traditional, and there's huge generation that is still traditional and of his generation that buys and can afford some of these wines, you know? So you have to be able to have both the tradition and then also, you know, the new generation. And that's what most of wineries struggle with, is how do you you know, do you reach out to everyone, or do you specialize? But in general, our cultures, you know, our generation is a little different, because he was focused, when he came to Armenia, he was focused on building foundations, right? Because he came to Armenia when no one was making good wine. So he had to prove, he was the generation that proved Armenia could make good wine. Him and that first movement, they came and they built those physical foundations of the winery, and that the infrastructure of the vineyards and the institutions, you know, of the wine schools. They built the foundations, and our generation, my generation, is we inherited these, and now now we have to build on there, and now we're proving what's next. And that, I would say, kind of reflects our divergence of where we are.
Well, I mean, one of the questions that we wrestle with is there is a disconnect I still see. I think that we're moving beyond it, but I think that there still remains this pronounced disconnect between wine's self image, right? What wine thinks of itself, and how younger audiences think of wine. I mean, on the one hand, I'm so glad that you talked about how we do still need to have the tradition. We saw a lot of brands sort of from 2020 on as they started to adopt digital. They went so whole hog into representation of millennials and Gen Z that I have sites that I go on to now that are selling $150 bottles of wine, $300 bottles of wine, and every person in all of their images is 26. And I'm like, but this isn't representative of your audience any more than the complete lack of the 26-year-old was before, right? So sort of balancing, I always say get the multicultural, or excuse me, the multi-generational families in the pictures where it's like grandmother all the way down to the recent 21-year-old. But yeah, like how do you reconcile all of these beliefs that the traditional wine industry has around itself? So awards, development of trust through pro reviews, the language that gets used on social media, oh my God, and tasting notes. And just how do you do that with talking to a generation that incredibly well educated, but just not interested in all of that bullshit?
I would say they're not interested, but deep down, I actually think they still think it's a stamp of quality. Like,
really? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, yeah, because my generation, I'm trying to I'm thinking of an example, but my generation, the wine industry and the beverage itself, wine, is different from beer because A, you can only make it once a year, and B, the grape is so tied to territory that it is in itself, it's a product of generations, and it's a product that spans, some brands have lasted for hundreds of years. You don't have that in other drinks, in the other drinks, in the other drink sections. So as a millennial and the younger generations, we still look up to the older generations for aspiration in terms of quality determinants because they can afford these high wines, right? And so to be able to afford those wines, there's something about respecting tradition and maybe counterculture wise choosing to be not traditional, but it's still foundationally what we define as quality. I don't know if I said that right.
So do you think that sort of the long-lasting nature of it lends a trust or a credibility that is like a starting point for, okay, this brand they've been around forever. My grandfather knew them. My mother knows them. I am 100% willing to give them more of my time and attention. But then what are the markers? So if you go back to, it really comes down to storytelling. We have to decide that story based upon the person that's sitting in front of us. If we're, brands are struggling to understand what to do with a 26 or a 29 or a 32-year-old right now. I don't even like talking about millennials anymore because millennials have kids and mortgages. But if we're talking about younger millennials, if we're talking about Gen Z, and then, oh my God, I recently had the first person ask me in an interview, this was about a month ago, what do we do with Gen Alpha? And I'm like, dear Lord, nothing just yet because they're not even legal drinking age. But if we look at how these generations are assessing credibility and trustworthiness. So something like, I'm just sitting here today finishing up a report on where we talk about YouTube and TikTokers who break down sort of like transparency in policy. So I don't know. Do you know a guy named his handle is Tanner Leatherstein? Do you know who this is? He's on YouTube.
I don't know.
He takes apart luxury leather bags and he explains to you exactly what kind of leather this is, where they would source it, what the cost of the materials were, what the cost of the labor was. Is it a good buy? Is it not good? Like it's not clickbaity at all. It's incredibly factual. And it's been really influential in how younger purchasers are choosing to invest in luxury handbags. So things like that, where we've got intermediaries who are conveying the measurements of trust. So, anyway, going back to the question, when you're telling that story to the person in front of you, how do you decide who the intermediary is, or how you communicate transparency, or how you demonstrate impact?
So, okay, before that, I just want to, because it's just touched something. So I would say that first, someone needs credibility, right? And because there is right now, with so much access to so many products and platforms, credibility is actually really difficult. How do you know a wine is good? And that traditional legacy of family generations actually proves the credibility, but it doesn't make them want to buy it. It's the first step. Now the wine is credible, it's going to be good, but then how do they get hooked on it, and why do they buy it again? And that's when brands have to, with long traditions, have to and family traditions, they have to first prove the credibility, and then they have to hook them to why continue to buy it. And that's when the special limited editions come in, the experiences in the vineyards and things like that, or that's when they get hooked and then committed. I just wanted to say that I think no matter what, that credibility needs to be established first, and that comes from tradition. So that's not going to go away anytime soon, I don't think.
I mean, you're quite fortunate, not only because of the region, but because of your background, all of your education. Let's think about, though, a new brand that's got brilliant winemaker, they've got gorgeous terroir, they have no heritage, no legacy, therefore ostensibly lesser credibility. What's their route to achieving attention?
Yeah, well, it really depends on who they want to try to get attention from, right? Do they want attention from people who follow Wine Spectator, and have their own collections, or do they want attention from millennials who will influence their wines by bringing them to all the natural wine bars? Those are two different kind of customers. So I guess it really depends on who your target audience is and who you want. But I think fundamentally it still comes down to building a community, and that's how they can do that, because you can build a community based on your current philosophy, not on tradition, but on what you're doing and your philosophy of the grapes and where you're going in the future. The allure can also be future; it doesn't have to be past.
The allure can be future. That's actually a great thing. I mean, like, I'm so glad that you said that. Can you please just expand upon that a bit?
Oh God. Well, because there's something like when you think about, a psychologist explained this to me once, that when you think about the future, it actually triggers dopamine and serotonin in your brain. So when you think about that, similar to clicking and getting likes, and you get these small little dopamine addictions on your apps, similar to thinking about the future. So if you have a brand that talks about the future, we're going here, we're going in this direction, that actually is triggering something really positive in your brain, just thinking about it.
Right.
Yeah, which is an interesting concept to explore.
So with that, it makes me think of like open homes, and this idea that you picture yourself in the house and this is a part of your life. And so that then leads me to questions around sort of collaboration and co-creation. We've certainly talked about that in the context of building the culture. You're having to do that. I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about the effort that you and your cohort are putting in for building brand Vayots Dzor, as it were?
Vayots Dzor, yeah. Sure. So when we look at this, came from a place of actually, when I was doing my MBA program in Burgundy, we looked at why some regions were successful and some regions weren't. Why does everyone know Margaret River, but they don't know the amazing wine region that's 2 hours north of the coast that no one can pronounce the name of? And that happened because Margaret River, collectively, the producers got together and they formed a trade association that promoted Margaret River as a region. And the other one who makes just as good wines and has just as good terroir, but the wines are half the price and they don't have this big unifying body that says, this is who we are, this is our identity, this is how, we move forward together. In Armenia, we're kind of like that because, well, first of all, we're still at the basics of figuring out appellations. We're still at the basis of figuring out how the wine is differentiated. The grapes grown, 200 meters lower in elevation are different and more riper, maybe, or have different nuances than the grapes grown, 200 meters higher in elevation. In Armenia, elevations matter a lot on identities of wines. And how do we define which region and what is the identity of that region? So right now we have every wine region and country in the world has a trade association that represents it. Wines of Argentina, wines of New Zealand, wines of Australia, they all have one. We have one, the Vine and Wine Foundation. That's what it's called, from Armenia. But when you look at Armenia, we have 5 wine growing regions. And Armenia is wonderful, but Vayots Dzor specifically as a wine region is a very particular region because it was separated under the Soviet times when all the other wine growing regions were replanted with brandy producing grapes. And then our Aimee grape was actually preserved and we were allowed to continue to make wine. So as a region, not only does it have the Aimee One Cave, which is considered to be the oldest excavation of winemaking from the Neolithic era, we have this region that has evidence of winemaking that existed thousands of years ago. And these grapes that were preserved during the Soviet times, this is such a unique, and everything's ungrafted. My goodness, the entire region is ungrafted. And so this is just incredible. But now we need to promote it and we need to protect it. And so that's why trade associations are so important in defining regional identity and being able to promote and protect it abroad.
So, that is an element of community. And then you've talked about community a lot. If we kind of build out from that with this notion of co-creation and collaboration with our audience and actually coming to turn our audience into our loudest voices, our strongest advocates. Lots of different ways to do it, lots of problems doing it, lots of kind of like, not so much generational, but just it's generational only in terms of technology adoption. So first, what is your perspective on that for a brand like Keush, right? We haven't really talked about Keush, sparkling wine. Oh my God, like one of the most fabulous things in the world to sell and market. How do you look toward this notion of collaboration and audience co-creation to, I guess in some ways, many hands make light work, distribute some of the absolute labor involved in messaging brands nowadays?
Yeah, I still believe, having worked the market, and then also, I still believe that the old school way of boots on the ground works. Like it is hand selling. At the end of the day, it is still hand selling. It's having that wine merchant recommend your wine because there's so much selection and there's so much offering. And at the end of the day, when someone walks into a store, they kind of want to be told what to do or they want to be guided. And so I think at the end, it's still that. But what's interesting, I think, where we can co-collaborate is there's other countries that are similar to Armenia, like Greece, like Georgia, like, Palestine. There's these countries that have all these old histories that are considered emerging wine regions, right? And as emerging wine regions, we're all kind of in this together, defining a new category outside old world and new world. We're all fighting the same battle of having people not want to pick up another Bordeaux or a Napa Cap, or maybe they were more experimental and now they went to, Argentina and places like that. But exploring this Middle Eastern area and this kind of, well, I say Middle East because that's kind of where the territory spans, but it goes from, in different areas, is still kind of scary. And a lot of it is scary because of the geopolitics and what we hear in the news. Palestinian wines, if it weren't in conflict, I'm sure would be championed more than they are today. When you hear about Azerbaijan and Turkey and Erdogan and Aliyev as leaders of these countries, does it make people want to buy wine from them? No. But if we collectively say, hey, look, we're regions that are re-emerging from ancient from ancient history to now, and despite all these geopolitical conflicts, we're here. That's where we can collaborate, is with these other regions, and because we have similar narratives and challenges.
Yeah, I think that actually that's so important to mention is that there is, unfortunately, our opinions are built by many different inputs, and the geopolitical inputs of many generations of, you look at Americans and what they were taught, what we were all taught growing up. And that in itself is an extraordinary hurdle to overcome that takes a lot of personality. Like, it can't just be fact based. And that is the reason, I do like that you say hand selling still matters, because even though we work in the digital space, I say to people all the time, if you think that digital is going to solve all of your problems, like, you're high. That's absolutely not the way of it. So I have a story about this. This is what I get for listening to you and not taking notes. So I have a story about this. One of my favorite restaurants in London is a restaurant called Oma, O-M-A. And it's one Michelin-starred restaurant, but like great prices, gorgeous food. And it's very Greek inspired. So Greek and Middle Eastern generally. They've got this gorgeous young Som. He came out, I asked him, I point blanked him. He came out of washing dishes, fell in love with wine, went on to become a Som. Anyway, last time we were there, there's always this notion of, well, what interesting things do you have on the wine list? Because I don't know a Greek or a more Middle Eastern wine list as well as I do a traditional European wine list. And he said, well, I've got something. They were just in. We just have a few bottles of it. Always a great way to sell a wine. It was a Peloponnesian Roussanne.
Wow.
And you're like, that sounds weird. Okay, absolutely, we're going to try it. What an amazing bottle of wine. And that kind of thing that I think that we have a lot of opinions within wine about the role of gatekeepers. And I don't necessarily know that we are doing enough to onboard what I'm going to describe as the next generation of gatekeepers, right? Like, understanding that for some of these gatekeepers, it is the Zulals of the world. It is this crazy thing that is beautiful to drink, but otherwise completely unheard of. And those people, as our advocates, and that is still a part of hand selling. That is still being present in those places, getting to know them. Unfortunately, it does fall into the being likable. I know it's just really something quite challenging for women, particularly, is if you're likable or not, and how that affects your business. But yeah, like finding that right linchpin within an organization who can fall in love with you and champion you, and just, yeah. So Peloponnesian Roussanne, we got to get Zulal on that list.
That's cool, but yeah, I will. They would fit in, right, in that kind of hand selling way, and I think at the end of the day, this hand selling and kind of, it's all human connection. At the end of the day, brands are built through human connection, whether you like it or not. Because if you want it to last, you can build something digitally, and everyone can buy 1 million bottles at once. But like, are they going to do it again?
Yeah, but
and
Aimee,
so having that,
it's expensive. Hand selling. I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up and say hand selling.
Oh, it's so expensive. Oh, it is. It is. Yeah. But does it last long? Does it last longer? When someone is committed to that Peloponnesian wine, will they continue to sell it?
Well, what you've just said is that marketing versus sales, right? That marketing is the getting out there, investing in growing awareness. It's going to take multiple visits. They may not love us right off the bat. We might have to get through a few vintages. We might have to prove ourselves. But that all falls into the category of marketing and long-term growth as opposed to sales and short-term cash flow. And one of the things that we talk about when we look at the demographics across, it does include sort of millennials and younger, is that, and you alluded to this at the beginning, they're not brand monogamous for a really, really long time, but they've got very long memories. And so if we're not investing in a generation in the long term, or if we're not investing in their awareness and interest and respect, right, in a long term, they just honestly they're never going to be interested in us. Okay, so I just want to bounce back to where the vineyards are, and all of the effort that's going in, and Zulal, and the appellation system, and the cost of traveling to hand sell all of this. So all of these come with risk, right? I mean, that risk is completely unavoidable. It has shaped a lot of the stories. If you look at something like the Iranian wine made in exile, profound risk that, I mean, there are physical risks, there are security risks, there are travel risks, but there are also risks that you've pinned a story, you've pinned a brand to a wine that at any moment might not ever get made again. So how is risk a part of that cultural storytelling and also the camaraderie and the collaboration that you see in building Armenian wine or the individual brands?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think it actually, probably a lot of wine producers in this region can relate to it. Because how do you talk about a wine that, Kush, for example, how do you talk about Kush and not mention that the vineyards sit between the two military bases? And I've gone on some market visits and I've been told by sales reps, do not mention anything about war or geopolitics because you're going to scare this customer away. And I'm like, oh my God, now I have to what? That's that's why these vineyards are so extreme. And our whole, philosophy is pushing boundaries and making, wine even in extreme conditions of elevation and soil and war. But some people really don't want to think about something bad or negative when we have so much negativity out there. They really just want fairy tales and butterflies. So it has made me wonder if we should talk about it or not talk about it. Now I usually
I'm going to interrupt.
It.
I'm going to interrupt on this because this is something that comes up a lot in marketing is what are the responsibilities of marketing? What are our responsibility for storytelling? Then if we're talking about trust and transparency, I feel like to not disclose that part of the story is disingenuous. Someone's going to find that story. You're going to go out there. So and also I will admit, and I've talked about this publicly before, I was there. You said to me, you're like, you want to go out to the vineyards? And I had to stop and think to myself. And I was like, kids are grown. I've done my job in life. Yeah, let's go. Right? It's honestly one of the most memorable wine experiences I will ever have. And gorgeous and fascinating. But yeah, I don't know how we can call ourselves a cultural product, a historical, a heritage product, and not talk about the elements of whether it's war or risk. I mean, it's happened throughout Europe. Yours just happens to be a lot more recent than some of the other stories that get told. So that would feel like not telling that would feel even riskier to me.
I agree. I agree to that. I would definitely, I agree. The flip side also is, war and conflict can be so exciting, that not to romanticize it, which is also really dangerous because that's really easy to do. But I think it just talking about it and the conflict, really shows resilience in a different level.
I'm going to tell a story here, and I hope that Felicity will be okay with this. So a couple years ago, Felicity drags me to a journalist conference in the States. And I really hope she's okay with me telling this story in the podcast. I'll ask her before I publish it. And we were going because Woodward and Bernstein were the keynote speakers, 50th anniversary of Watergate. What we didn't realize until we got there is that it was a conference for high school and college journalist students. So we were like two of the oldest people in the room, and they therefore must have thought that we were professors or, she is a journalist. I am not a journalist. And so they started asking her questions, and Felicity looked at them and said, well, you can follow the history of the world through the wine industry. And just went on about history and movement and, grapes in pocket, suitcase clones and sort of all the way that wine is tied to growth and exploration and heritage and culture. And here are these college and high school students hanging on her every word. Like they never had thought about wine in the context of the history of the world that they live in. And it was remarkable to see, because I sat there as the marketer thinking, oh, there's something here. Like, this is not dry history storytelling. This is that thing that's in your glass that makes you feel good and impresses, your hot friend. Also has this incredible legacy of community building and culture building and country building and economics. And so anyway, there's my story about why I think the history matters so much.
I agree, and I think that's why wine isn't going anywhere. Yeah, global sales are down, but it's not going anywhere.
It's not going anywhere. So wine isn't going anywhere. We're doing okay, even though we're in some tough times. You are building a couple brands and spaces where there's no benchmark. There's no real years, decades worth of reporting about how Armenian fine wine is selling or how you're stacking up against competition. So you don't have the same sort of markers for am I successful that perhaps other producers or other regions have. How do you personally, given age, experience, you've got a degree. We haven't talked about it. You've got your MBA in wine. It is an MBA in wine, right? From Berkeley? Yeah.
Yep.
So you've got like a full business background. How do you understand if these projects are successful?
So success, I guess success I think it's difficult for a lot of people to define, but I think it feels less like arriving at a destination and it's more like more like the vessel of what you're doing. And I think international claim matters, that's proof of concept. I think if you get 100 points in a wine or you get written and raved about in wine publications, that definitely proves the quality of wine. But does it really make it successful? And like, what makes it successful? Is it creating brands that have a high value and price point? For me, it's not really monetary. Especially as an Armenian, because as Armenians and diasporans, we're going back to our homeland and we're so committed to protecting and promoting it that success is really, just more proof that we can be resilient for generations. And I think I actually thought about this at some point. If someone's asked me, like, where do you see the future of Vayots Dzor going, or what is your dream for the region, or where is it, when you hit that success point? And I think it's if I walk into a bar in New York and I ask for like an elegant, light-bodied red with like lots of layers, and I need like a really cool story, and the sommelier recommends an Arani from Vayots Dzor and tells me about like the Kochari dance, the Armenian dance. And I think that would be the moment that I would say, wow, like we've really created something greater than, just making a wine, because it means that we've also learned to be carriers of our tradition and culture. And it's not just for us, it's for shared humanity, and I think that is kind of where that I would define it as. It's an interesting question.
I love that. What an amazing note to end on. Thank you, Aimee. I'm so grateful for your time. So where can all the listeners find all the wonderful things that you're working on? So Zulal, website, online, Google, Kush, tell me where are you in the world?
Totally. Right now, the easiest way, because we are rebranding and redoing all of our websites, but you can still find our wines online. But the best place to go is storicawines.com because they ship to most states in America. So you can find them there.
Okay.
Yeah. Or
wonderful.
you can do that, or you could also follow me on Instagram, Aimee Keush at Aimee Keush, and then you can kind of follow along, and I reach out. I respond direct messages.
You're also going to get the good photos there. Highly recommended.
Yeah.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you, Aimee. I appreciate your time. See you next time.
Awesome. Always a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.